Can you take 6, please? Park up. Right, welcome to New Horizons, everybody, and a massively happy New Year to you all. And a huge welcome back to Neil Sanders with MK Ultra, LSD and the Hippy movement. Neil's interest and expertise in the research and exposure of mass social conditioning, highlighting the brilliant minds and cold hearts of certain types of, usually men. Social conditioning has been around for centuries, varying from overt and aggressive to gradually more subtle. The Inquisition, for example, or the coercion of men and underage boys to fight during World War I, for instance. The boys being presented with a white feather by girls, themselves altered in some way. The men exposed to persistent newspaper headlines and propagandist posters. My grandfather was an infantry soldier at 15 after no doubt feeling the call of duty. Neil tonight focuses on the marked increase in certain drug availability and sudden appearance of a group of young people worlds apart from their parents during the mid-60s and onwards, the hippies, who may have evolved naturally or, on the other hand, been the result of a well-planned experiment. So, without further ado, let's find out a little bit more. Neil Sanders, thank you.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Yeah? Excellent, that's the spirit. Right, okay, so hopefully some of you know who I am. I tend to talk about mind control. Mind control falls broadly into 4 categories. Trying to coerce information, truth serums, getting information from interrogation scenarios, wiping people's memories so that they cannot reveal facts and such in interrogations. The total control of emotions and physicality, which can be done through hypnosis, it can be done through trauma, it can be done through the use of certain machines, radio waves and electromagnetic functions. And then the final type falls into the category of propaganda and some social control, perception management, directing the social trends and such like that. So today what I'm going to talk about is LSD principally, and how LSD links in with the 60s movement. Hopefully all of you have got sort of like a cursory knowledge of what I mean by, say, flower power generation, the anti-war movement, the hippies, and the 60s music scene. My contention is that, sadly, the whole thing, the elements that started the 60s, that sort of fermented the 60s, and then the elements that ultimately destroyed the 60s were all intelligence agency experiments. This is my contention, and hopefully I'm going to show that with this talk. So, one of the main ways of sort of creating mind control is through trauma. I don't know if anyone's ever been in like a car accident or anything like that, or knows anybody who's been in a car accident. Often you won't be able to remember the actual crash itself. You'll sort of wake up at the side of the road, or you'll have to be told later what happened. So, oh no, yeah, you span across the road and you ended up flipping the car 3 or 4 times. That's not because you've blanked out, it's not because you've become unconscious or anything like that. What it is that your brain has a defense mechanism whereby very, very traumatic memories, it will blank them out, it will create an amnesic shell around them, therefore basically stopping you from reliving that traumatic experience again and again and again and again. And this is why basically when repressed memories come back, that's why it happens, because these amnesic barriers are breaking down. If you can do that enough, what you can do is you can split the mind into several sort of barriers like this, like a sort of honeycomb or a grid pattern. Each of the individual sort of, sections could be considered like an individual personality, and they could even be unaware of the other personalities. So that is one method. But what we're going to talk about today is the druggings, essentially. Now, although the application of trauma is effective, it was very, very effectively used by the CIA and also by Nazi Germany as well. What they wanted to do was they wanted to gain a far more measured control in response to stimuli, and so the CIA were far more interested in the use of drugs and also the use of hypnotic suggestion. The drugs such as LSD were seen as a potential weapon due to their hallucinatory and perception-altering effects. Now, in 1951, In the French town of Pont-Saint-Esprit, it is alleged that the CIA released a cloud of high-grade aerosolized LSD into the area, which basically caused mass hallucinations. Several people went mad, and a couple of people actually ended up dying. One person drowned under the effects of the drug. Now, actually, if you go into the official records, the Pont-Saint-Esprit incident is still explained as being the result of the fabulously psychedelic qualities of some mouldy local bread. But to be quite honest, if we're being brutally honest, the fact that the allegation that the CIA basically attacked a nation state with an experimental drug has always floated ominously on the horizon. An undated CIA document entitled D-lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD-25, stated, "Some of the more outstanding effects are the mental confusion, helplessness, and extreme anxiety which are produced by minute doses of this substance. Based upon these reactions, its potential use in offensive psychological warfare and in interrogation is considerable. It may become one of the most important psychochemical agents." So where did LSD come from? Well, the psychedelic drug LSD was first synthesized by the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, and he was working for a company called Sandoz, S-A-N-D-O-S, which is now called Novartis. And this is a pharmacological laboratory in Basel, Switzerland. And he first discovered LSD in 1938, but it wasn't until 5 years later, in April 1943, that he actually discovered that it had psychedelic properties. Now, the reason that he was looking into LSD was to obtain a respiratory and a circulatory stimulant, which is known as an analeptic. It basically is for use in surgery. But whilst he was resynthesizing this in 1943, he accidentally absorbed a bit of it into his fingers. Some of you may know that LSD, you can absorb it through your skin. And so serendipitously, he managed to discover the fabulous psychedelic properties of it. And he described the events. He said, "I was affected by a remarkable restlessness combined with a slight dizziness. At home, I lay down and sank into a not unpleasant intoxicated-like condition, characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. In a dreamlike state, with eyes closed, I found the daylight to be unpleasantly glaring. I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes, and intense kaleidoscopic play of colours. After some 2 hours, this condition faded away." And so this was with an absolutely microscopic dose of LSD that he managed to do this. So 3 days later, on 19th of April 1943, Hofmann decided to perform what would be termed an ill-advised experiment on himself in order to determine the true effects of LSD. See, Hofmann ingested 0.25 milligrams or 250 micrograms of pure, uncut LSD, an amount which he predicted was a threshold dose. Now, some of you probably know that a threshold dose of LSD is actually just under 20 micrograms, so what he had actually taken there constituted more than 10 strong hits. Now, less than an hour after administering this, shall we say, Herculean dose, Hofmann experienced sudden and intense changes in his perceptions. Now, he didn't think that this was a very good idea to stay at work, so he decided to go home. Luckily, he was persuaded not to use his car because it was illegal in the time, because it was during wartime. So far more sensibly, he decided to make a trip home on his bicycle, which I think we can assume was probably at least difficult. Now, those who participate in recreational LSD have since named this fateful day, the 19th of April 1943, as Bicycle Day. And so if somebody says that they're enjoying Bicycle Day, basically what it means is that they're going to go and take some LSD. And it is commemorated with stamps in Switzerland as well. So, on this psychedelic journey, basically his condition began to deteriorate incredibly rapidly. His mind raced with very powerful feelings of anxiety, and he actually began to believe that his next door neighbour, who he'd never really got on with, he thought that the explanation for this was that she's a witch and she's cursed him and that he was going to die because of it. Later, when he sort of started to calm down, he realised that it was the LSD, but then just thought, oh, I've poisoned myself, this is no good, is it? And so eventually a doctor was called and basically tried to attend to the wildly tripping Hofmann. And he seemed fine. The only thing that actually seemed physically wrong with him were his eyes were the size of saucers. But apart from that, he was physically okay. So the doctor basically sat and chatted to him for, I think he basically took him about an hour of just calming, talking to him, soothing and chatting to him. And eventually his anxiety was replaced by what he described as an exquisite euphoria. And again, Hoffman described this. He said, "Little by little, I could begin to enjoy the unprecedented colours and plays of shapes that persisted behind my closed eyes. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegating, opening, and then closing themselves in circles and spirals, exploding in coloured fountains, rearranging and hybridising themselves in a constant flux." Now this is LSD that was produced by Sandoz. This is obviously years later in 1951. But in 1947, and you've got to remember, this is when the CIA was first starting, this is when the CIA was taking its fledgling steps and moving from the SS to the OSS to the CIA. And so it was incredibly interested in LSD because obviously it could be a game-changing drug. At the same time, the US Office of Naval Intelligence was beginning mescaline studies. Mescaline is basically kind of like LSD, it's not quite as potent, it's more soft because it comes from peyote, which is a mushroom, so it's not as very intense as LSD is. And they were using this for interrogation purposes under the sponsorship of Project Chatter. Now, the same year, 1947, LSD first appeared in Swiss pharmacological journals, but it wasn't until 2 years later in 1949 that a gentleman called Dr. Max Rinkel actually brought LSD back to the United States from Sandoz and began experimenting with patients in hospitals in Boston. Soon after this, also in 1949, a gentleman called Nick Bursell started experimenting covertly on patients in hospitals in Los Angeles as well. In 1953, which some of you may know is when MK Ultra was starting, Dr. Humphrey Osmond, who was part and was financed by MK Ultra, began treating alcoholics with LSD. Whether he was actually treating them or whether this is a cover for examining the effects, we will probably never know, but I lean towards the latter if I was being honest. Now, the same year, in 1953, the CIA, who was clearly taken with this new science, attempted to buy 10 kilograms of LSD from Sandoz laboratories. Now, bearing in mind that a single gram of LSD contains around 10,000 doses, so with such a large order, we can assume that the CIA was trying to corner the market in this particular substance. Unfortunately, Sandoz informed the CIA that at that time, only 40 grams of LSD had ever been made in the entire world, and so unfortunately, 10 kilograms was a little bit out of their hands. And this is basically because making LSD is incredibly difficult. You need to get the precise conditions on ergot mold in order to cause the lysergic acid, and then you have to do several other things to do it to make it turn into LSD. So the likelihood that these French people went mad from eating mouldy bread it's just rubbish, isn't it? So what happened? So the CIA basically didn't want all this LSD, so they decided that the best thing to do was go to the pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly. Now Eli Lilly said, okay, fine, we can't produce the real thing, but what we can do is we can synthetically copy it and we can synthetically start to produce LSD for you. And in 1954, the CIA began Operation MK Pilot. Now, MK Pilot was taking place at Lexington Narcotics Hospital. This is essentially like the Priory or something like that, so people are there to get treated for drug addiction. And instead, specifically black heroin addicts were tested with LSD, not for any particular curative reason, just to see how much LSD one particular person could take. Now, the same year, who would later spearhead Tavistock, the Tavistock Institute's LSD experiments in the Haight-Ashbury area, had his book, The Doors of Perception, published. Now, the Doors rock group actually took their name from from the title of that specific text. And we'll come back to Aldous Huxley later. Now, in mid-1954, the pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly finally synthesized LSD at the CIA's behest, and this basically gave the CIA a limitless and relatively inexpensive supply, and it removed the necessity for Sandoz, the Swiss pharmaceutical company, to provide their stockpiles. A year later, in 1955, Aldous Huxley actually experienced his first LSD trip, and then shortly after he published his essay Heaven and Hell. Now, Heaven and Hell discusses the relationship between bright, colourful objects, geometric designs, psychoactive substances, art and profound experiences, and it's a promotional tool for the use of LSD. Heaven and hell refer metaphorically to what Huxley perceives as the two contrary mystical experiences that could potentially wade you through the doors of perception. Essentially, you're going to have a good time or you're going to have a bad time. Now, in 1961, the army actually initiated the use of LSD in interrogations on foreign agents, and this was called Operation Third Chance. Another operation that also used LSD in interrogation scenarios was called Operation Derby Hat. However, by 1962, officially the CIA withdrew support for above-ground LSD research studies, but this is absolute garbage because basically the Tulane University was carrying on with Robert Heath, Harvard was doing experimentation, McGill University in Canada, Colgate University was doing it, St Thomas's Hospital in London was doing it, Lexington in Kentucky, and about 40 others basically. So the idea that they stopped actually using LSD is something of a misnomer. And at the same time, Congress passed and began to enforce drug safety regulations. So what they did was they made the substance illegal. Now, in the same year, the FDA designated LSD as an experimental-only drug and strictly restricted research. And by April 1966, Sandoz had officially stopped supplying LSD to research scientists. This is not because they care about you and because they don't want you to harm yourself on LSD. This is so that only the CIA can study it. That's it. That's as simple as that. There is always another reason behind any drug legislation. In this particular thing, it was so that nobody else could get to understand how this particular drug worked. And as I say, Ewan Cameron was still using LSD throughout the 60s in Canada, as was William Sargent in London. And LSD experiments were also performed in Birmingham Hospital in England under a gentleman called Joel Elks, who later went over to America and continued with MK Ultra. And the other thing is the children were also tested with LSD, and not just a few, quite a lot. Creedmoor State Hospital in 1963, I believe, released a report talking about 4 to 14-year-old boys that were given daily intravenous doses of LSD, just to basically see what happened. Now, in a memo describing the purpose of one particular MK Ultra program, Richard Helms, who was the head of the CIA at the time, stated, "We intend to investigate the development of a chemical material which causes a reversible, non-toxic, aberrant mental state, the specific nature of which can be reasonably well predicted for each individual. This material could potentially aid in discrediting individuals, eliciting information, and implanting suggestions and other forms of mental control." Now, they were obviously doing lots of experiments with these various types of things in safe houses and hospitals and various places all over America. Now, one particular New York Times article actually explained the hopes of those involved in those experiments, and this was an expose of the history of the CIA. And so the experimentation was aimed at finalising techniques that could not only be used on the enemy, but also for reasons of national security on their own previously loyal agents. And this is the quote. It said, "They wanted to reduce a man to a bewildered, self-doubting mass, to subvert his principles. They wanted to direct him in ways that may vary from rationalising a disloyal act to the construction of a new personality. One of their longest-running goals was to develop a way to induce amnesia. They wanted to be able to interrogate enemy espionage agents in such a way that neither the agents nor their superiors would know that they had been compromised. And they wanted to be able to wipe clean the memories of their own agents after certain missions, and especially when they were going into retirement." I want you to remember that for the second half of the talk, wiping people's memories.